Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Jonathan Dekel-Chen is back with us this week to talk about the release this past Saturday of his son Sagui from captivity in Gaza. You may remember that Jonathan came on the pod last August to share Sagui's story and the story of their entire family during the devastating October 7th massacre. And it really was a massacre in their home kibbutz of Neri. But on Saturday, Sagui thankfully came home, along with his kibbutz mates Yair Horn and Sasha Trufanov, and we'll get a sense from Jonathan about what Sagui went through and how he's doing now, what it's been like for the entire family these last few days, especially Sagui's amazing wife Avital and their 3 young daughters, and also about the prospects for the Gaza ceasefire deal to continue and for all the remaining hostages to be released, hopefully. On that point, just a quick state of play recap from me. So for the record, we're recording this podcast on Wednesday afternoon, Tel Aviv time. Tomorrow, Thursday, we're expecting 4 bodies of deceased/murdered Israeli hostages to be returned and repatriated back to Israel. As many of you have already heard, this will likely include Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir Bibas, tragically. On Saturday, we're expecting the release of 6 live Israeli hostages, which, by the way, their names have already been made public, so that's already known, followed likely next Thursday by the final release of the last 4 remaining hostages, all deceased, again, tragically, that made up this so-called first stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal. And that will be that. By the end of next weekend, essentially early March, we'll have come to the end of both the release of the 33 Israeli hostages earmarked for this first initial 6-week stage, 25 of whom came out alive, thankfully. And we'll have done it all ahead of schedule since Hamas, for reasons known only to it, but we can surmise, they agreed to move up the hostage release schedule. And then what? What happens after that? That's the question. That's the big question. There will still be 59 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, half of whom are still believed to be alive, which is crucially important. According to the terms of the deal that was agreed last month in January, negotiations over the follow-on stage 2 of the ceasefire deal were supposed to begin over 2 weeks ago. That was delayed, and it's not at all clear to me whether those talks have even begun, even now, in any real and meaningful way. So stage 2 was always going to be extremely tricky. Hamas would likely have been called upon to release all the remaining living hostages, and Israel would have had to commit to ending the war and fully withdrawing from Gaza. Like I said, very tricky stuff indeed. So absent a full and official stage 2 agreement, what might we be looking at in terms of options? So option number 1, to my mind, is that Israel and Hamas, via U.S. and Egyptian and Qatari mediation that we've come to know, agree to simply extend phase 1 indefinitely. The ceasefire continues to hold, the hostages continue to come out, fine. But let's be clear, and we should be clear, this is the Israeli government's preferred option, but it of course takes 2 to tango. At some point, Hamas may decide that it's no longer useful or in its interest to keep depleting the only insurance policy it really has, i.e. the hostages, in return for just a temporary truce. So that's option number 1. And look, they may be able to extend the ceasefire for a week, 2 weeks, but likely not indefinitely, I don't think. So option number 2, basically there's no extension of phase 1, the ceasefire falls apart, and the war is restarted, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other senior Israeli government ministers have threatened, clearly, to restart the war. So this would, as Jonathan talks about, spell likely doom for the remaining hostages inside Gaza. So we also have to be very, very clear-eyed about the implications of restarting the war. And Jonathan talks about that at length and quite forcefully. So bottom line, much, if not everything, on this issue, as with many other issues, will depend on what Donald Trump actually wants to see happen in this part of the world and what he doesn't want to see happen in this part of the world. So to be determined what happens really after the end of next week. Let's get to Jonathan Dekel-Chen. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome back to the Israel Policy Pod.
Thank you for having me again.
It's really our great pleasure, Jonathan, especially this week, for all the reasons that we know. And I think I speak for everyone listening when I say that we're all truly happy for your son, Sagui, for you personally, for the entire family, that Sagui is now back home after nearly 500 days in Hamas captivity in Gaza. You came on last August to graciously and courageously share Sagui's story with us, and I do urge our listeners to go back to that August 21st episode and listen to the entire backstory of Sagui and the family, especially on October 7th. Harrowing and, again, courageous stuff. I think it's also fair to say that throughout the past few months and really over the past 16 months, you were a tireless advocate on Sagui's behalf and on behalf of all the hostages all across the world, speaking and meeting with world leaders in many cases, pushing to get a deal done and to get them all home. And there's obviously more work to be done on that front, which we'll get into in just a bit. But let me start off by saying, other than Mazal Tov, Jonathan, let me ask, it's been a few days since Sagui was released last Saturday. How's he doing?
Well, there's a long answer to a very simple question, but I'll give you the short version. And Sagui has been reborn, and he miraculously survived nearly 500 days of living hell. And his body is going to take quite a while to recover. I mean, it's true on two levels. One is specific to Sagui, which is that he sustained serious injuries on October 7th. We knew that. He received, like all the other hostages, minimal, if any, medical treatment. So the simple fact is that both in his upper body and lower body, he's going to need a lot of medical attention here in Israel to recover and then rehabilitate. More widely speaking, look, any of the released hostages who came out of the tunnels, as opposed to earlier hostage releasees who had been held above ground, those who were underground did not see daylight for nearly 500 days, had to survive on minimal nutrition, if any, and unclean water, very sparse medical attention, sanitary conditions that I suggest no one try to imagine, and every moment fear of death from their captors, whether they were from Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, but also from friendly fire, meaning Israeli forces doing battle above their heads. They were just as aware, the hostages were just as aware of that as were the terrorists, their terrorist captors. And Sagui told us of many moments where the workings of the IDF, of course, not intentionally, put them at great risk. So anyone who emerges somehow by way of some miracle from that experience for so long is surely going to be carrying that for a long time.
Undoubtedly, like you said, a living hell for over a year. And again, we'll get into the conversation, shall we say, about whether they could have or should have, definitely should have been released earlier. I'm curious, like everyone here in Israel and all around the world, we're glued or have been glued to our televisions every Saturday for the past, 5 weeks, watching the various hostage rounds be implemented, and the mass, rallies and demonstrations by Hamas and during the release and the handover of the Red Cross and all of that. And some hostages seem to be, I guess, doing better than others, at least physically or outwardly. And some, like 2 weekends ago, looked like they were coming out of a concentration camp. So in terms of both a father and an Israeli watching the releases unfold, are you looking at certain aspects even before Sagui was released about the hostages' conditions? What's going through your mind when you see them actually come out and be handed over to the Red Cross?
Well, there's both expectation of seeing people emerging from the valley of death. And yet there's also enormous concern to fear, particularly, as you mentioned, the week before last, with those 3 hostages released, who most definitely looked like Holocaust survivors. And for me personally, there was, I would say, another layer onto this. And my late father, was a Holocaust survivor who somehow lived through 6 years of life, if one can call it that, under German control, up to and including a death march in late April of 1945. And so seeing those really walking cadavers that had emerged, the hostages who had emerged the week before, made me extremely nervous as to what Sagui and any other hostage would look like upon leaving those vans and in the moment of transfer to the Red Cross. Thankfully, in the case of Sagui, Sasha, and Yair, who were released last Saturday, their condition was relatively, but again, it's just relative to the week before, their condition was somewhat better.
Yeah.
And, who's to say what we hope 6 going to be released this weekend, live hostages, and 4 murdered this Thursday, of course. But we hope and pray that the 6 living hostages who come out this Saturday will look more like Sagui and less like Eli Sharabi, who was released the week before.
Yes, we can only hope, but like we both know, you never know until the release actually happens on the Saturday. Is Sagui back with you in Kiryat Gat? Is he still in the hospital? I know that you and I think most of Nir Oz, the kibbutz that was so heavily decimated on October 7th, have decamped and are temporarily in Kiryat Gat. So I'm curious, is there a proper kind of release back into the community for Sagui?
Most certainly. I mean, his wife and little girls and the whole community are just waiting for him to come back to living with us. This, of course, is not our permanent home. We're here temporarily. But we don't know when that will be possible. That will depend entirely on the judgment of the wonderful doctors and medical staff that are treating him and other released hostages. And yes, there is a protocol, but the protocol depends entirely on the physical condition of each individual. So at this moment, we don't have a projection on when he's going to be able to leave the hospital. It's a major hospital near Tel Aviv, where most of the hostages, released hostages, are being treated.
That's very well understood, and I suppose you need to err on the side of caution and provide all the care that they require for as long as they require.
Yeah, they come back all of them have come back in very weakened condition. Their immune systems have been totally compromised, and so you may have heard that an earlier releasee, yet another member of Nir Oz, Ofer Calderon, from 2.5 weeks ago. He was released after a few days, and but didn't go very far. There's kind of a hotel facility right nearby, so that they can continue to be the releasees, continue to be treated. But he got a case of pneumonia very quickly and had to be readmitted to the receiving hospital in Tel Aviv, where Sagui is for further treatment. So this is a very tricky business. And it's kind of at the edge of medical know-how, because it's not like this is a common occurrence for someone to emerge quite literally from the valley of death after 500 days and know precisely how to rehabilitate them. So, it's not trial and error for sure, but there's more unknown than known in terms of how exactly to reintroduce these men and women into the general population, as it were.
It's unprecedented, and I think Israel is creating this protocol for the returnees after over a year in captivity. Oftentimes, like you said, in tunnels. Nothing like this has ever occurred before, especially to civilians, just purely civilians. Again, we don't need to belabor the point, but there are still young babies from Nir Oz being held in captivity that may be being released tomorrow on Thursday, which we'll touch on in just a second. Jonathan, in terms of Sagui's wife, Avital, and their 3 young daughters, there's a new addition right? A new baby girl was born while Sagui was in captivity, Shachar Mazal. And we all saw the video of Avital telling Sagui about the new addition to the family and her name. We were all obviously looking on and probably not a dry eye across the country when we saw that clip. Correct me if I'm wrong. Sagui only found out that Avital and the girls were alive a day or two before his release, right?
Well, he didn't even know that. There was a complete information vacuum around the hostages that were together with Sagui. And a couple of days before the release, he and those who were released with him were moved to a different space underground where he was able to piece together. He was not told outright about his family, but he was able to piece together from overhearing and television and so on that Avital and his older girls had survived. He did not know at that point whether his third daughter had been born. He learned that only after having crossed the border by prearrangement with us. They were met there, of course, at the moment of transfer from the Red Cross to the IDF by an IDF team. And at that point, and there is tape of that somewhere, he was told that Shachar had in fact been born, but they didn't relay the name. That was Avital's privilege when we met him about an hour afterwards.
Incredible. We saw like a snippet of a clip, right? But I can't imagine what it was like in the room in the hospital when that was going down. On that point, I'm curious. We saw you. I think you also embraced him after he embraced Avital. I think initially, and you wrapped him up in a big fatherly hug, and I believe you said "Welcome back" in English, right?
Yeah, somehow that's what came out. Our language of communication is Hebrew. I'd never spoken English with my kids, which they always criticize me for now. But yeah, somehow that's what came out at that moment. It seemed the most natural somehow.
Yes, and I hate to kind of pry too deeply, but you've been waiting 16 months for that moment. Had you given thought to how you personally would greet him, say hello to him, or did it just flow spontaneously through that moment?
Yeah, it's entirely spontaneous. Honestly, I may have spoken with you about this back in August. I had a different image of Sagui's reunion. I had thought, I hadn't thought about it too much, but, or I thought about it every day, but not whether it was going to be possible. Mm-hmm. This scene in my mind that he would walk through some door in some room or hallway, and his three little girls and Avital the three little girls would jump into his arms, and he would embrace Avital. Now, that was never going to happen because of mainly the health protocols. And so the girls only wound up meeting him a few hours later. And so I had always thought I was going to be a bystander to that moment. In the end, Avital and my ex-wife, his mom, and I met him in that space in the army base close by to the border. And that image of him reuniting first with his girls was really what drove me to get up every morning, to, face whatever challenges might be there during that day, to keep this campaign rolling as powerfully as possible in Israel and in my case, especially abroad, knowing that if all of the hostages were to somehow not be in the public eye, then the likelihood of them being released would be lower. And that scene with him and the little girls was what got me there every morning.
I can definitely imagine that, Jonathan. As we all know, but you and the other relatives of the hostages know better than anyone, this has not been an easy campaign to get everyone on board, which again we'll touch on in just a second. I have to ask, just in terms of the reunions and the videos that were put out, some families give more access, some agree to less access. But I'm curious, how does that whole process work? Since this is arguably, definitely the most private and sensitive moment of your respective lives. But you also have an entire nation and world watching on. So how do you, as the family and the parents and the deciders on this issue find the right balance between what's definitely private and personal and the public and national interest, if we can call it that.
Look, I think there's no magic formula to this. And again, it's not like, and there's a guidebook. There wasn't a guidebook for 500 days in terms of what's a family supposed to do to help gain the release of their loved one. And in the same sense, there's certainly no guidebook for a family to know what to do once that loved one has returned. We are a private family. We always have been. Everyone makes those choices. That first batch that have, kind of gone viral in the world, and those images were taken by the government press office, the Israeli government press office, and the IDF spokesperson. We approved everything that went out. And right now, again, every family makes its own choices, but we're in a space, and he is in a physical space, kind of what they call sort of the inner sanctum in the hospital, where there just aren't a lot of cameras around. And that's on purpose, because the key right now is the recovery of the releasees. And I realize that there's an imperative in the public for more and more, particularly given the power of Sagui and Avital's story, which is, it has really captured, and I'm aware of that, has captured the public's imagination, certainly in Israel and perhaps in certain quarters abroad. But the emphasis right now is getting Sagui right. And there will come a time when perhaps more will be released. But for right now, and for the foreseeable future, days, perhaps weeks, that's really the only important thing for us in terms of getting Sagui back where he needs to be.
Absolutely. And well understood. Although, like you said, the interest in terms of the hostages that have returned and their families who have become almost, in Hebrew they say bnei bayit, they're a part of the household. People very much feel like they know Sagui, they know Avital, they know many of the other hostages that have returned. It's definitely a challenge to try to balance that insatiable public interest with what's a real, I imagine, private and health need.
There are a lot of frustrated journalists out there who really want more visual material and more interviews and so on. But in our case, at least, we're not ideal customers in that sense.
No, it's fine. And look, speaking as a journalist, the journalists will get over it. We're big boys and girls. But as with any story or issue, but especially this one that's so sensitive, again, it definitely should be the family's prerogative how much they are willing to share, especially in the immediate aftermath of the release and the reunion. In terms of your own life these days, Jonathan, obviously this has consumed you and the rest of your family for months and months on end. And obviously you're still advocating and working on behalf of all the remaining hostages that should be released and should hopefully be released soon. But how do you personally feel now that Sagui is back? Has your life changed? I mean, what's your daily routine now that your son is back, but obviously there's a lot more work to be done?
Well, a focus, of course, of the daily routine so far has been to be with him for some time during the day. Just the treat of it, not that I can help him very much. That's what the medical professionals are for, of course. But just to be near him and around him is just joyous. And beyond that, I've continued for the last couple of days. I've restarted the advocacy efforts. For me, this isn't a vague concept. Yes, there are 73 hostages who must be returned, but of those 73, there are 20 hostages still remaining from Kibbutz Nir Oz. We've always represented a massive disproportion of the hostages, and that remains true. And, these are not just faces on a poster for me. These are my friends, my neighbors, kids that I helped grow, my best friends' children. All of them deserve the same kind of joy that we're feeling right now in our family. And I have an absolute commitment to making that happen. Those that can be rejoined with those hostages who are still alive, and we don't quite know, there isn't proof of life for all of them. And no less important, truly no less important, for those who have already been murdered, to allow some closure, to allow those families the simplest human right to bury their loved ones together in our land. And so, again, these aren't just faces on posters for me, the 20 from Nir Oz. And so I am fulfilling my promise to get them all home. I kind of told the people at the Hostage Families Forum, those 20 are on me, getting them home, and the Hostage Forum can take care of the rest.
That's very magnanimous of you. I'm speaking on behalf of the forum, who I know well, but that's very magnanimous of you, Jonathan, because for 16 months you were, like I said, a tireless advocate, not only for Sagui, but for all the other hostages, and very much in the States and around the world. And so the fact that you're continuing with that effort, I don't think is a given. I'll put it that way. By the way, just in terms of Nir Oz, last time you were on, you said the place was eradicated by not just physically, but also just the sheer numbers. Nir Oz, the hardest hit kibbutz, on October 7th. What is it? Over a quarter of the community was either murdered or taken hostage.
Yes.
I'm curious, what's the state of the kibbutz now? What's the state of the community now? And I have to ask also, last time you were on, you said Sagui's second love were the buses that he converted into, mobile homes, but also mobile groceries and mobile classrooms now. So what is the state and condition of the buses as well that were in Nir Oz?
Well, we'll start with that. We were able, kind of under fire in the early months, really, to transfer 2 of the buses that he was working on to the Israeli nonprofit that he was working with. And so it's called Ofanim, the nonprofit. And those buses, those mobile technological classrooms, have been at work throughout the country since this past summer, which is a thrill. And he was so happy upon hearing that. It was one of his first questions, actually. He's chomping at the bit to get back to work on the buses. And while he was in captivity, he planned out the next ones, what he wants to do with them. But I'll keep your listeners in suspense as to what he's been planning. Really quite extraordinary. As far as the kibbutz community is concerned, physically Nir Oz looks pretty much the same way it did on October 8th. Burnt out, collapsed. Some of the landscaping has regrown, which is beautiful because it was kind of a Garden of Eden.
It very much was, for anyone that had not visited Nir Oz before October 7th. And even, by the way, after October, I mean, it is really, I said it last time, probably the most beautiful kibbutz down there.
I would say so. When Ben Gurion put out that famous phrase, he wanted the Negev to bloom, that's what he had in mind. And not just the residential part, but also robust agriculture, which is what we had, certainly. It remains to be seen how much of the agriculture will be able to regenerate. Many of our the leaders of our very highly technological, really hyper-productive farm were murdered that day. So there's an awful lot that needs to be rebuilt. In terms of rebuilding, the Nir Oz community has begun the planning for that rebuilding. Essentially, most of it just has to be plowed away. It's irreparable. There are discussions right now in our community about how much of it to leave as a living memorial to what happened and reminder of what happened on October 7th. We as a people, both Israelis and Jewish people, must never forget. And that's not just a tired old phrase. October 7th is something that must never be forgotten because it was a massive failure of the Jewish state. Politicians, the army, I would say, generally speaking, the army and our intelligence services have bounced back from that in terms of what they've been able to accomplish since that time. I unfortunately am not sure at all that our politics have accounted for what happened before and on October 7th, and certainly not for decisions made since then. Going back to the Near Oz community, what we now know that it was still kind of unclear in August that about half of the families, half of the households of Nir Oz will not go back, will not resettle in Nir Oz when eventually it is rebuilt. These are mainly the young families and, old fogies like me that are grandparents of those young families. They were too traumatized, and they remain too traumatized to ever think of going back to Nir Oz, which in a sense it was a killing field on October 7th, and they all experienced it. So we are now working, I would say over half of the surviving community is now working towards transplanting our lives to a different kibbutz called Beit Nir. I know all these names and kibbutzim can become very confusing, and not very far from Kiryat Gat. And, we're moving together with them and to a degree with the government to get there.
So that's interesting that a large proportion of the kibbutz will, by choice, relocate and not go back to the original Nir Oz, but that Nir Oz will definitely still be rebuilt. That's understandable, given everything that you've been through. Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
As Phase 1 of the ceasefire deal nears its expiration on March 1st and Israelis brace for the upcoming releases of living and deceased hostages, Israel Policy Forum continues to provide timely updates on the hostages' plight, the state of Phase 2 negotiations, and questions surrounding the future of Gaza. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky to view our updated timeline tracking the progress of the hostage releases and for analysis on the war in Gaza and Israeli-Palestinian affairs more broadly. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that Israel Policy Forum's work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
I want to take you, Jonathan, from the more personal to perhaps the bigger picture, diplomacy and the ceasefire for hostage deal, and really what we may expect or hope for moving forward. But looking back in August when you were on the podcast last, there was even back then talk and hope of a deal being consummated. Obviously, that didn't happen for another 5 months, unfortunately. But I'm curious in terms of just the process and how this unfolded from your vantage point. When did you get a sense that a deal was actually close and actually realistic? Something that everyone had been hoping for really over a year. And when did you find out that Sagui had made the list of the 33 hostages set to be released as part of the first stage of the ceasefire?
Well, the first time following that very first round of releases in late 2023, when it stopped midstream. Say the next time I felt any kind of optimism, but it was cautious optimism, was following Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington. I believe it was in late July, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And during that time, President Biden invited us, the U.S. families, to come in and participate in a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and to talk specifically about moving forward towards completion. Just for your listeners, they may know that the deal that is now moving forward, and we hope will move forward to completion, in its general structure has been on the table since at least late May, announced by President Biden and in coordination with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it's not 5 months, it's more like 8 months since this very same deal to save lives has been on the table. In any case, in late July, right next to the Oval Office, we heard, because we challenged Prime Minister Netanyahu to promise that no more obstructions, and he didn't deny that there had been obstructions, no more obstructions, no more lagging behind in talks, no more keeping our negotiators from negotiating, actually. And he did that in the presence of President Biden and his senior staff. Shortly thereafter, the sort of boondoggle of the press conferences that the prime minister gave in English or in Hebrew and then in English about the Philadelphia corridor completely torpedoed the possibility of moving towards an agreement or signing of an agreement. And then it became very clear that on this government's part, there was no intention of coming to a deal. Inside of that, there's also, of course, the murder of 6 hostages, that their bodies were recovered, including Hirsch Goldberg Poland. And the first time that I personally thought there might be a chance was not the election of Donald Trump, but a couple of days thereafter. I don't remember the exact date, but it would have been in the second week of November, last November. He came out with his first statement about hell would be paid if it wasn't if this deal wasn't completed. And in Israel, of course, the spin was, well, that was directed entirely towards Hamas, that threat by the incoming president. And I knew, because of conversations and also just my understanding of the landscape, that he meant everybody. And that would include Israel, mostly, of course, Hamas, but also Israel and the intermediaries. And all of them understood the threat, even if here in Israel, the government, for its own reasons, chose to kind of ignore, or at least publicly ignore, the fact that it was also under notice that it also had to comply by the inauguration date. And subsequently, there were a number of other statements by President Trump and his incoming senior officials, Steve Witkoff, Mike Walls, and that gave me optimism that there was a chance that something good was going to happen. And, lo and behold, just before the inauguration, the agreement is signed. And, we've been moving forward ever since, with some bumps. Obviously there have been some bumps. Even the week before Sagui was released, it was looking very bleak because of Hamas's statement and then counter statements by the Israeli government that were very unhelpful. But in the end, that week passed and 3 hostages were released. We heard, like the rest of the world, that Sagui was going to be released the Friday before. We really didn't know if he was going to be released. That list of 33 for the first stage, it had been circulating for months with minor adjustments. And so the fact that he was, once the agreement was signed in mid-January, we weren't terribly surprised that he appeared on the list again. They're almost identical, if I recall correctly. That list that had been public knowledge, I think, since maybe July or June, perhaps. So there wasn't a big surprise there. But what the release itself would look like and what Sagui himself would look like, those were all complete mysteries to us until last Saturday morning.
And I imagine you couldn't have known with complete certainty that he was amongst the living hostages and not the dead hostages.
That's correct. Until Hamas announced that he was going to be amongst the 3, we had no conclusive positive sign of life for Sagui since early December 2023, through the testimony of women and some teenagers who had been released in that first round, many of them from near Oz.
Yes, and we should mention that after the past, 5 weeks of hostages being released, that once again we're getting, over 20 proofs of life for hostages that have remained in captivity. Yet further proof that there are a lot of people to still get out from the Gaza Strip. And by the way, Jonathan, our listeners are well versed in terms of the ins and outs of the negotiations over a Gaza hostage deal over the past year. Yes, we haven't held our criticism either with regard to the various machinations of the prime minister here and the government. I think last time you called it abominable and embarrassing conduct by the Israeli government, especially as it related to or compared to the Biden administration. But I think from what I'm hearing from you, it's safe to say that Donald Trump really made the difference to get at least this first stage over the line, correct?
Yeah, in terms of energy and just brute force. It's another Sadly, another proof of concept that in the Middle East, including in Israeli politics, the only way to really push things forward, certainly things that cost something to the political actors themselves, is through brute force or the threat of brute force. Again, the deal that's being implemented has been more or less on the table since late May. The only, sort of speaking in scientific terms, the only variable that changed was the election of Donald Trump, or the only major variable that has changed was the election of Donald Trump. Hamas was already on its knees in, late July. The entire defense establishment and intelligence establishment in Israel, heroes of Israel all, were screaming that the time had come in late July to finish the deal. And that, as we know, did not happen.
No, it didn't happen. And you're right, Jonathan. It's literally the same deal that was on the table last summer. And no matter what various people, both here in Israel and other places, may try to put out there publicly, but I think that's a story for a different podcast. Looking ahead, given that the first stage of the ceasefire deal will likely wrap up next week or next weekend, given everything you know about the real ins and outs of the negotiations, or maybe lack thereof in terms of a stage two, follow-on stage for this agreement, are you and the other hostage families optimistic, pessimistic in terms of the prospects for Israel and Hamas to agree to continue the ceasefire, to get more hostages out? And what do you expect the Trump administration to do in this instance, maybe compared to what it did last month as well?
I think they've been very consistent. Steve Witkoff, Adam Boehler, the president himself, Mike Walls, they've been very consistent and have not wavered. They want all the hostages out. And they're willing to go bare knuckle with the various players to make that happen. I see no evidence or even hint that has changed even a little. At the end of the day, obviously, the Israeli government and Hamas leadership, whoever they are, have to, kind of concede to this. I want to believe, but I don't know. I want to believe that at least on Israel's part, Prime Minister and his allies will recognize that, like everybody, that this is an imperfect deal. Some details, of course, can be, moved around for stage two, but this is the deal that we have. There is zero proof of concept that more military action by the IDF is going to produce more living hostages to come out. On the contrary, there is ample evidence that more military pressure under the circumstances will only yield more bodies amongst the hostages, if we can ever recover them after more warfare. And I also want to believe, look, Prime Minister is he's aware of history, and he must know somewhere deep in his heart that if he prefers his own narrow political interests over saving the lives of the remaining hostages who are still alive and returning the bodies of those who are not, he is destined for kind of eternal damnation in the annals of Jewish history. We have examples like that, but nothing that would approach leaving Jewish captives consciously to die, because that is the implication of going back to war. And if he prefers that over saving their lives and then dealing with whatever needs to happen with the day after in Gaza, and there are many options out there, then God help him in his legacy.
Eternal damnation, yes. And also, I think you even said it last time you were on, Jonathan, these were Israeli, in many cases civilians, but also soldiers who were abandoned by their country. And so it behooves the country and the government that leads the country to do everything possible to get them back.
We are agreed.
Final question to you, Jonathan. I think you're in a delicate way uniquely positioned to answer this question. But as we both know, and as our listeners know, we're set to get 4 deceased hostages, murdered hostages, back tomorrow, Thursday, as well as next Thursday. and that'll finish up the first stage of the ceasefire for hostage deal, as well as 6 living hostages this Saturday set to come home. So it's going to be, I dare say, a very difficult and complex few days here in Israel. The joy of the returning 6, along with the heartbreak of the 8 that are coming home, although tragically not alive. You and the other hostage families that have received your loved ones back home alive maybe be able to speak to this better, like I said, better than anybody, but there's almost kind of this bipolar sense, I think, amongst all Israelis about how to really process this ordeal, the living versus the dead that are coming home. Do you, as hostage families, speak about it amongst yourselves? Is there a level of, I hate to put it in these terms, but sense of kind of guilt in terms of, well, you got Sagui home, but what about ex-hostage that may be hopefully coming home, but no longer alive?
No, amongst the hostage families, I've never felt that. There's desperation all around, for sure. But my experience, and it's possible that there are some hostage families that feel different, and that kind of divide and conquer or divide and control amongst hostage families has come entirely from outside by way of Israeli politicians. I'm ashamed. Again, there's a lot of shame here. I'm ashamed to say it is part of their rhetoric, both explicit and implicit, to try to divide the hostage families and reduce the force of their campaign. I do hope that as a country, once everyone is home, and I hope we begin to see a better future for ourselves and for Gaza, because there's no better future for Israel. There isn't a better future for Gaza, no matter what some of our politicians say. I hope that there will be a reckoning for what has happened here, up to October 7th and afterwards. This is not the country, or we'll put it differently. The people of Israel in these last 16 months have shown the commitment and the force of character, and by and large, what we would expect in terms of empathy and solidarity with the hostages and the hostage families. The same, none of those can I say for our government to date. And, it's painful. I came to Israel, my own volition in 1981, believing that, it's not going to be a perfect country, but there will be a degree of righteousness among our leaders that will be different than any other country. And, at least for me, the past 16 months have been a very rude awakening.
That's really elegantly put, Jonathan. I don't know if I have anything to add. I share your sentiment, and we can only hope that after all the hostages come home, that will be the moment for repair and recovery, not just for you and your families, but for the entire country. We can only hope. And that'll require real leadership, I dare say, and not a leadership or, a political class that has tried to tarnish the hostage families and their campaign to get their loved ones home. I think that's shameful, and it hasn't succeeded, frankly. We see it according to every poll. 60 to 70% of the Israeli public consistently has been in favor of a deal to get the hostages home, to the credit of the country, the real country.
That's exactly correct. There are the people of Israel that I believe in more than ever. The politics of Israel in all directions. And perhaps the politics, the organizational politics in the Jewish world outside of Israel have been very disappointing, in my view, during these last 16 months.
That's an interesting point. I don't know if I want to delve into that. You're basically saying that they could have done more to support the people of Israel and the hostage families relative to, say, supporting this politician or that government.
We'll leave it at this, Neri. There is support for Israel, for the state, for the people of Israel, which I think is the prerogative of diaspora Jewish organizations, those that deal with, of course, advocacy and support for Israel. That's why they were founded. And I'm a historian of the Jewish organizational world, so I know a thing or two about it. They were never founded explicitly to support the government of Israel, of any color, of any party. And I think we've all been witness, certainly those of us who pay attention to such things, that amongst the major Jewish organizations abroad, this has been a very problematic period. And, perhaps we'll talk about that some other time.
I look forward to continuing the conversation, Jonathan, to get a further update on Sagui, Avital, you and the entire family, and also to hopefully touch on, I don't want to say, brighter or more optimistic issues, but you're an expert on Eastern European politics and history and Russia and Ukraine war. So I think there may be a lot to talk about on that topic very soon. So hopefully we'll have you on to discuss that issue as well.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's really our pleasure, Jonathan, and big hugs from all of us here to you and Sagui and the entire family. Take care.
Thank you all.
Okay, thanks again to Jonathan Dekel-Chen for generously giving us his limited time and for sharing his experiences of what the past few days and weeks and months have truly been like. We can only wish Sagui a full and speedy recovery. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and get them all home now.